Hello and welcome back to ThoughtBat. In today's video, I'm going to be responding to Hakim and his video titled Libertarian Socialism with Authoritarian Characteristics, which was published just under a year ago. You'll notice that this is my first response video in over a week and a half of my channel's existence, but this one comes with a script as, unlike PragerU or Ben Shapiro, I actually take Hakim seriously, and his arguments deserve better than the knee-jerk reactions I give to the other two. To clarify my own position on things, I'm an anarchist. I believe in the direct worker control of the means of production in the form of cooperative enterprise and the abolition of a state apparatus. Mutualism, if you like. In his video, Hakim claims that the libertarian/authoritarian divide does not materially exist. This is a rather big claim to make given the prevalence of debate and conflict between those labelled as authoritarians and those labelled as libertarians throughout the history of socialism. The heated debates within the First Internationale, the conflict in revolutionary Catalonia, and the Soviet invasion of the Free Territory of Ukraine, just to name a few examples. The first problem I have with Hakim's argument is that he doesn't define the terms authoritarian or libertarian, further than give a rundown of some of the strategies that each camp advocates in order to draw similarities between the two. Due to the lack of such definitions, it is easy to home in on the characteristics and strategies shared between both camps when you're making an argument that claims they are one of the same. I would define authoritarianism as the tendency to advocate or adhere to more centralised power structures in order to achieve a political goal, and libertarianism as the decentralisation of power structures and the promotion of personal liberty. It should be noted that, whilst incompatible, the two tendencies are not true opposites of one another. Authoritarianism is a means to an end, and libertarianism, politically speaking, is an end in itself. This leads me to my first materialistic difference between libertarian and authoritarian socialists. Libertarian socialists limit their practices and seek to constrict the power of the state so that it does not infringe on people's human rights or their civil liberties. Authoritarian socialists, on the other hand, do not abide by such principles. For authoritarians, so long as the practice moves us towards the end goal of communism, it is a tolerable policy. By the way, this is a simplification of an incredibly complex paradigm which deserves a lot more of this 10-minute video to cover. The bottom line, however, I think is comprehensive. Throughout the first half of the video, it seems to me that Hakim is using the terms violent and authoritarian interchangeably. Now, this is a strange thing to do for me, as, of course, not all violence is directed by some central authority. Hakim also claims that, quote, anyone who advocates revolution is by definition authoritarian, end quote. Now, this is a problem for me if you haven't actually given a definition for authoritarian. In any case, violently resisting a mugger or a cop is certainly not an act of authoritarianism. On the contrary, it is a defence or an assertion of one's personal liberty. Violently resisting tyrannical force is not only necessary on many occasions, but also highly recommended by anarchists, both in theory and on the ground. Violently dismantling capitalism is also on the table, as we see capitalism as yet another manifestation of tyrannical violence. This peculiar Marxist equation of violence to authoritarianism has its roots in a quote from Engels in his essay On Authority, which was also a response to anarchist objections to the authoritarianism of Marx and Engels. Here is the quote. A revolution is certainly the most authoritarian thing there is. It is the act whereby one part of the population imposes its will on the other part by means of rifles, bayonets, and cannon. Authoritarian means, if such there be at all. And if the victorious party does not want to have fought in vain, it must maintain this rule by means of the terror which its arms inspire in the reactionists. Would the Paris Commune have lasted a single day had it not made use of this authority of the armed people against the bourgeois? Shall we not, on the contrary, reproach it for not having used it freely enough? I'll link the essay into the description below. This counter-argument to the anarchists failed to address their objections. The anarchists who threw Marx and Engels out of the International did not do so because they believed capitalism would be defeated and repressed with kind words alone, but because they were staunchly opposed to the totalitarian state which Marx and Engels wished to replace with the bourgeois state. The anarchists predicted that the Marxian state would eventually degenerate into a bureaucratic class of its own, hold a monopoly on revolutionary thought and viewing its working class subjects as an expendable means to an ends which the state will never admit is possible in order to justify its own existence. Now, this is a major concern for anarchists, as our philosophy is fanatical about the dignity and the autonomy of each individual person. The 20th century, for the most part, has proven those anarchists to be correct. The intricacies of the failures of the Marxist-Leninist states to achieve their theoretical goals deserves a whole series of its own, but I think the bottom line is self-evident. In the second half of Hakim's video, he questions the intentions of those who call themselves libertarian Marxists. As I'm not a Marxist of any kind, I can't speak for them, but a good reason to add the word libertarian would be to suggest that they don't adhere to Marx's take on the use of the state. Hakim suggests that those who call themselves libertarian are doing so to disassociate themselves from what Hakim calls successful revolution, in order to look more presentable to moderates. Whilst I agree that they may want to disassociate themselves from countries like the Soviet Union, it's to highlight the fact that they generally don't support those establishments. In the West especially, the socialists attempting to appear less radical call themselves democratic socialist and not libertarian Marxist, because Marxist is still a dirty word to the moderate ear, so I wouldn't pin that accusation on them. Now, for me personally, I would still use libertarian socialism even if I'm in a socialist space. This is because the term libertarian is an indication that I don't advocate socialism to be managed by the state, but by the individual workers themselves. Whilst I was in the middle of writing the script for this video, Hakim released a new video called Breadtube, Debatebros and the Problems of the Western Left. In this video, Hakim makes an attack on market socialism, claiming that it's a new trend amongst Western leftists, despite it predating Marxism as a theory. He then also, I think, strawmans market socialism by painting them as holding that markets are to be the final result of society. Now, of course, there's no such thing as a final result of society. Rather, it changes and evolves with time, with the more rational thinkers advocating a reasonable guide for progress. As a market socialist myself, I do see it feasible that markets could wither away due to them no longer being necessary as a mode of resource distribution. To begin his attack on market socialism, Hakim quotes Lenin by saying, "Markets at every turn reproduce capitalist relations every single second of every single day," and attempts to amplify this remark by explaining that competition will still be present in a market socialist economy. Now, I don't consider this to be coherent. Capitalism is not defined as people competing to sell products within a market. It is defined by the private/absentee ownership of the means of production and living. Unless Hakim or Lenin can prove that cooperative enterprises competing in a market economy will reintroduce the concepts of private and absentee property, despite it resting on its abolition, then this attempt to dump market socialism into the capitalist bucket is just that, an attempt. Hakim then sets up a false dichotomy between a brutally competitive market economy, whereby the employees of cooperatives which go bust are left to rot on the streets, or a system in which they would become dependent on the welfare state. The alternative proposed by market socialists, who are also often anarchists, is mutual aid networks. Now, this isn't as flimsy of a solution as right-wing libertarians telling the poor to rely on charity, as worker cooperatives are far more likely to engage in mutual aid and community support. The reason for this is because the owners of each company, who are also the employees of the company, have a far more direct and immediate incentive to raise the quality of living for the communities in which they live. Reducing poverty reduces crime, for example. Modern-day capitalists don't have such incentives because they do not live in working-class communities, and so no comparison should be made between how capitalists manage their income to that of the working class. Hakim concludes the segment on market socialism by referring to Yugoslavia as an example of market socialist failure. Despite meeting my own standards of what defines a market socialist economy, Yugoslavia suffered from a wide range of political and economic problems, including that of being economically dependent on hostile nations, its own undermining of workplace democracy, such as appointing managers which best fit the interests of the ruling party, and of course the oil crisis. Now, I know this isn't a sufficient response, but Yugoslavia deserves a video of its own, and I'll link that video in the description when it eventually gets published. To conclude, I think Hakim's perspective of libertarian and market socialism has been negatively influenced by his experiences with online figures who represent those ideologies, as well as the remarks made by his go-to theorists such as Engels and Lenin. These misunderstandings, I think, can be alleviated through a conscious effort by anarchists such as myself and Marxist-Leninists such as Hakim to engage in better faith dialogue across the aisle. Whilst, like Hakim, I don't believe in the concept of the left unity, this doesn't mean that there's no room for cooperative dialogue to be made between both camps. This also means making an effort to read the theory which is backed by our counterparts, in order to better understand their perspective, and to gain a better understanding of the criticisms of our own ideologies. For Marxist-Leninists and other anarchists, of course, I strongly recommend delving into the theory provided by economists such as Benjamin Tucker and Kevin Carson, with the latter being a contemporary mutualist. The specific book I would recommend is Studies in Mutualist Political Economy, in which Carson gives a comprehensive analysis of the theories of value and a detailed case for anarchist economics. I have plans for a summary video of this book, but that's for another time. For now though, I hope you found this video informative. If so, give it a like and subscribe to the channel. If you have any criticisms of anything I've said, please do let me know in the comments. But for now, that's all from me. I'll see you next time.